Hi everyone, thanks for taking the time to watch this recording. This is a recording of my IAIR 2020 conference presentation. Let's put on a happy face and take modeling back from the negative vibes of COVID, where we'll be talking about using some statistical modeling techniques for a variety of purposes at Elgin Community College. So it seems like the news recently has put a bad rap on modeling per se. We have modeling that was done as part of COVID testing, where there were all sorts of models predicting death rates, and they seem to be all over the place in terms of their general ability to forecast. Just further complicating the issue in general from the national narrative. But then even thinking more recently with respect to the national presidential polling that was being done, the forecasts themselves and the modeling that was done with respect to the results and how those were going to turn out still apparently up in the air, at least at this point in time, did not give a lot of confidence to the conversation regarding modeling in general from the layman's perspective. And so what I was hoping to do with this presentation is illustrate a way that we've been using modeling at Elgin Community College that hopefully puts a little bit of a more positive spin on things. And that's where our story picks up here. So we're, in this instance, talking about how we've been using modeling just recently at UCC to help set criteria for and also help score applicants for a new scholarship fund that was recently developed. Just as a little bit of background information, the scholarship that I was mentioning will go into a little bit more detail in a couple slides. But the target of the scholarship is what at our institution we call near completers. So those students who have already completed at least 45 credit hours, which for most associate degrees is generally 3/4 of it. So they're theoretically 15 credit hours away from earning their associate degree, but have not yet done so. At our community college, as well as presumably most others, that group of students is kind of considered the low-hanging fruit. I'm using my air quotes here. For student success intervention efforts, because those students have already demonstrated a commitment to earning credits and progressing towards their degree, but the thought is need some sort of help to get over that finish line. And so from the perspective of that student success intervention lens, there were a couple interesting factors that kind of came together at UCC recently that it helped speed along this scholarship that I mentioned, but also this process of looking more analytically at how we help our students. And one of those factors was a recent changeover in our foundation board. So we have always had at UCC a very active board. They've always been incredibly supportive of the institution, but we have some new board members who are much more interested in accountability and looking at things from an analytic perspective, is the best way I can say. So not just taking standard generalizations as evidence, but actually looking for numbers and looking for some more hard-hitting evidence to indicate that whether or not the things that the college is doing and the foundation is helping support are being effective. And there's also, then, as the chart here illustrates, a general stagnation of our graduation rates. UCC, in this case, the dark blue line showing the full-time graduation rates, and the light blue showing the part-time graduation rate. Our grad rates have, in general, at least for the full-time students, been slightly above our peers in terms of our iPads networking, but there's been a stagnation over the last few years, especially, and our part-time graduation rates have as is the case at most community colleges, but still something that was of concern to administration at the college, but also our foundation board. Our part-time graduation rates have not improved much over at least a decade, and that's a fairly consistent historical trend. But then we also have feedback from students where for that near completed group, some of the more recent, I'm sorry, not the more recent, but some other recent campaigns that have been done, some student success intervention efforts that have been done focusing on those near completer students have been some calling campaigns. So trying to entice students who had dropped out to come back after having a certain number of credit hours to come back to the college. We've had a couple years worth of telephone campaigns where we would call those students, and then there were other calling campaigns to call other students to entice them to come back, especially now that enrollment is declining for nearly everybody. And in the course of those calling campaigns, what we have found from our near completer students is that historically they tell us that work obligations have been a problem, family obligations are a problem in terms of impediments to their finding time to be able to do their work, and then finances is another big issue that seems to be the case for our near completer students regarding their ability to pay for the tuition. And so with those factors coming together and with the impetus of our foundation board, they were interested in developing some sort of program or initiative that they could help support or primarily support that would help help us get those near completer students over the finish line quickly. What we see in the graph here is our historical graduation rate for those students, those near completer students that have achieved that 45 credit hour threshold. At the bottom of the graph is the year that a student has met that 45th credit hour. As you can see, there are generally very few students in that group who graduate within 1 year of meeting that 45-hour threshold. So getting those final 15 credit hours within a year seems to be difficult for the vast majority of the students. When we look at a broader time frame of 3 years after that meeting that 45 credit hour threshold, a majority of students do eventually graduate. And so seeing that those students historically have obviously been very committed to get to that 45 credit hour threshold, and then in most cases, students are taking up to 3 years and in some cases even longer after that point in time to get to their associate degree. These were conversations that our foundation board was having about ways that they could help facilitate that process to help get students over the finish line quickly. And so that led to conversations about seeding some sort of foundation fund, some foundation resources that could be provided to these near completed students to help get them over the finish line quickly. And in the course of those discussions, what the foundation board stated was important to them was that they have evidence. So they were interested in this first year. This was a spring 2020, I'm sorry, fiscal year 21 campaign that was set up. We began the process in spring of 2020, and what they had initially stated was that they would be seeding essentially the first year's worth of scholarships or funding in this case for the near completer students. But they wanted to be able to have evidence after this first year to go back to their constituents to say, this is obviously a program that's working for our students, and we need your help in helping get more students over that finish line. And so, unlike in past years and unlike in past programs and interventions, evidence of impact was important in this instance, and that's where we kind of tied into the statistical modeling that we'll be talking about in just a moment. And then the foundation also stipulated that sorry about that, the timing was important. So improving that graduation rate for students who have already completed 45 credit hours and trying to reduce that from, say, 3 years to 1 year was an important characteristic of this intervention that the Foundation Board had mentioned. So in the course of asking students what sort of funding would be most helpful, what would a program like that look like? After we had heard this kind of preliminary discussion from the Foundation Board, in the course of our call campaigns for those near completer students, we conducted a separate survey, and this was in fall of 2019, where we asked that same group of near completer students, what would be the resources that would help you get over that finish line within just a year? And so we intentionally limited it to just a handful of options that the Foundation Board had expressed interest in possibly funding. So various dollar levels of scholarships, policy changes that we might be able to work with the enrollment and admissions office to facilitate emergency funding, additional child care, parking options, things like that. And we conducted a conjoint analysis, so asking students in numerous fixed pair groupings what would be the least impactful, what would be the most impactful of various options. And so in that way, students are kind of rating in direct comparison each of the possibilities against each other. And so what, as you can see, what we found is that obviously the scholarship was the top option in terms of what students said would be most helpful. So dollars seem like they're the most broadly accepted form of student intervention. And so that was part of the analysis here, is we wanted to see if there would be an importance from the student's perspective in terms of dollars to help them get over any hurdles they might be facing, or policy changes. And so it seemed like dollars had the edge there in terms of the scholarship. But we also wanted to see what would be the dollar amount that would be kind of that threshold for students where it just wouldn't be as impactful. And so that was a valuable piece of the conjoint analysis, where, as you can see here, the $5,000 and $2,000 scholarship options were the most popular of the choices. But then we also had a $1,000 scholarship option, and that was one that, in the course of this survey analysis, we found was not as popular as some of the policy changes we mentioned. And so it seems like in the course of this type of analysis, what we're able to see is that $2,000 seems to be the kind of default limit, where that would be the minimum dollar amount for helping students in terms of a near completer scholarship funding. And so all of those precursors that I mentioned in the discussions came together to create the student scholarship that I have been talking about all this time in just general terms. At ECC, we call it the Complete to Compete Scholarship. It was came about as discussions with our foundation, with the IAIR office and our foundation board, with the help of all of our financial aid folks and student service folks. And this scholarship is being implemented for the very first time for fiscal year 21. So near completer students enrolling in fall of 20 were the first eligible for this scholarship. The application opened in spring of 2020, and we have been accepting applications over the summer months up until this current semester. The Compete to Complete Scholarship has a handful of requirements, but as with many of our scholarships, not a lot. So students are required to have a 2.0 cumulative GPA or higher. That's an institutional policy. As I mentioned before, this is specifically for near completer students, and so they have to have at least 45 credit hours earned previously, and they also have to have some sort of unmet financial need. With respect to, so some of these are criteria that I mentioned. Oh, and also obviously as a near completer, the students can't have yet earned their associate degree. But there's also some conditions with this scholarship that came about through those discussions that I was mentioning with the financial aid folks and the student service folks in the foundation. First is that the students have to a pledge to complete by the end of the academic year. So there isn't any penalty or any significant punishment that's associated with that. It's just a verbal pledge that in the course of the application, the students are asked to sign off on. But it is a nonverbal, or I guess it is technically verbal, but it is a an indicator to the students that the purpose of this program is to help them graduate within a year's time frame. And they also have to agree to meet with their advisor at least once each term. So that's an important aspect as well, where traditionally our students who have been here a couple of semesters don't often meet with our advisors, at least from what we hear from our advisory folks. They typically spend the majority of their time with students who are in their first or second semester. And so as students have been here for a while, they tend to stop meeting with their advisor, or at least stop meeting on a regular basis. And so this was also part of the program was requiring that students meet at least once a semester with their advisors. And then finally, as I had mentioned before, with the pendulum analysis, one of the options was the $5,000 scholarship, and as that was identified as the most helpful option, that was the dollar amount that was used for the scholarship itself. Plus, there's an additional $1,000, so it's a $6,000 total scholarship. But the additional $1,000 is included as a stipend after the student graduates. So another enticement to actually get over that finish line. And that's intended to be a supplement for students to help with student loan payments when they graduate. So, those are the conditions that are associated with the Complete Scholarship that was developed as part of this discussion. So all of that is a pretext up to the modeling part that I had spoken about before, and it doesn't seem like in and of itself the development of the scholarship would be anything that would even be remotely related to or of use to model, or I should say modeling of use to developing the scholarship. But there were a couple key characteristics of this process that actually do lend itself to the kind of modeling that we'll be talking about in just a moment. First was that there's limited funds, as with most scholarships, but especially in this instance where we're beginning this first year, this pilot year, with a limited amount of funding that's seeded by our foundation board. And so the interest there was that we identify a way to demonstrate that the funding is going to students who would need it most, so that obviously there's never going to be enough money to be able to help everybody that would need it, but how to identify and how to help those students who would most benefit from that funding. And then also, as I mentioned before, one of the concerns of the foundation board was how to go out to the constituents, to go out to the community, to request additional funding later on. And they wanted to be able to have evidence to say, we know that the scholarship is truly making a difference in these students who are receiving it, and they wanted to be able to approach that conversation with some evidence. And so that's where, from the statistical modeling approach, logistic regression and propensity score matching are actually useful. And we'll be talking about how that's in both of those aspects. So identifying which students would most benefit from the funding that we're talking about, and then also how to say that the scholarships themselves are actually making a difference. That final question, identifying the impact of the scholarship, is one where we'll also be talking about survival analysis, although we haven't completed this pilot year of the scholarship program yet. So that survival analysis piece hasn't been completed. Our first round of students are expected to graduate in the spring of 2021, this upcoming spring. And so we'll be conducting the survival analysis to identify what impact that scholarship has had on students in the program at that point in time. But we'll also be talking about why that is and why we might be able to use that method. So remember, I was mentioning that we're using logistic modeling, and there's in the course of creating this modeling approach with respect to setting up a scholarship. There are a number of milestones that are helpful and where we can kind of piece in that conversation about statistical modeling. So we have the identification of the scholarship period. So those are all of the near completer students that I was mentioning before, where students have met a certain threshold of credit hours, they have a certain GPA, they have a certain amount of financial need. That's our pool of students that will be identifying as potentially eligible for this scholarship. But within that group, we also want to do some sort of ranking of which students theoretically would most benefit from receiving additional funding or additional help to earn or complete and earn their associate degree. And then from that group, we also want to identify some comparison groups. So how do we identify a group of students who are within this near completer pool of students but don't receive a scholarship? How do we identify an appropriate comparison group so that we can do those kind of outcome comparisons later on between the recipients versus the non-recipients, to say that we truly are finding that there's an impact of this money that students are receiving outside of other factors that could be complex. And so each of those steps will utilize the I call a likelihood of success score that comes as an outcome with respect to conducting logistic regression analysis. And that's where we piece statistical modeling, and in this case specifically logistic regression, into the actual process of identifying and analyzing the scholarship process. So just as a quick refresher for anybody that's not already familiar with logistic regression, it's similar to multiple regression, except that in logistic regression, you're looking at dichotomous outcome variables. So it lends itself to educational examples where you're looking to see whether or not students have completed something or not, or whether students have attained a certain threshold or not. It's very useful in that sense for comparing two different outcome variables, or I'm sorry, two different groups of an outcome variable. And so in this case, we're considering in the development of the model historically whether students have near completer students have earned their associate degree within 1 year or have not. That's kind of a dichotomous outcome in this sort of analysis. It's useful in that it can include covariates that are linear or categorical, but then it also yields an expected probability for that outcome. That's what I was mentioning before, is the likelihood of success. So in the course of doing the analysis with whatever covariates are included, it calculates for each individual record the likelihood or the probability of attaining whichever of the desired outcomes you have set as the reference. So for example, if we're looking at whether or not a student does or does not graduate within a year of that near completer pool, including a handful of covariates, the predicted probability or the expected probability score would then be the likelihood of a student attaining that graduation outcome within 1 year versus another student who might not. In the course of actually conducting our own version of this logistic regression, this is a listing of all of those covariates that we have included. So we have some general categories of demographic variables, financial variables, credits, and then catch-all of some other ones. This was, for all intents and purposes, in conducting this modeling to generate some probability scores for historical cohorts of students. This was, generally speaking, most everything that we knew about students at that point in time, and what we would know about students in conducting this, replicating this model then for future cohorts, what we would know about students at the point in time prior to their actually earning the degree. So we have a number of important demographic variables here: the year, the cohort year, their gender, disability status, race and ethnicity, first generation status. We have a number of financial factors: Pell status, whether they're having ECC or MAP grants, and then credit hours, how long it takes them to get to 45 credit hours, to that threshold, what identifies a year completer, the percent of part-time hours, how many hours earned in past years and semesters, and also attempted. And then also some of the other factors included their cumulative GPA at various points in time, trio participation, and when they actually completed the FAFSA course. In the course of conducting our initial analysis, we found that there were a number of variables that were multi-collinear. There was a lot of multi-collinearity, so they replicated a lot of the impacts. And as you probably would have guessed, hours earned in the year that they attained 45 was correlated with hours earned in the next year, was correlated with hours earned in the prior year, was correlated with the hours attempted. All of those hours earned and attempted variables correlated highly with each other. And so in the course of conducting this analysis, that what happens then in logistic regression, just as in multiple regression, is that the impacts of each cancel each other out, because that you're essentially dividing up any sort of impact amongst, in this case, each of those 6 variables. We had the same issues with cumulative GPA, where GPA across various points in time for a respective student obviously correlated very highly with each other. So, so they were they ended up causing some multi-collinearity that canceled out the impacts of each. And so, in the course of actually conducting the model after testing for these multi-collinear effects, we included just the hours earned in the year after a student earned 45, and that was done purposely for identifying any potential credit hour threshold that would be useful in setting parameters for the scholarship that we were developing. So this model that I'm talking about is what we were doing with historical cohorts of students to develop those relationships, identify those scoring, the actual model that would be used for the scoring for future students. And in the course of doing so, what would be most useful is, for the in-time purposes of developing the scholarship application, would be to identify the number of credits that were most successful or most predictive of whether or not a student graduated within 1 year's time. And so we used hours earned in the next year here, thinking of how that would be applied once we actually got to the point of developing the scholarship and applying it to current students. We selected cumulative GPA in that year that students earned the 45 credit hours, because that was one that where we had a threshold already of 2.0 for institutional purposes. And so what we wanted to do is use the GPA that a student had in the term that they completed that 45 credit hour mark as an indicator of how what value might add to their performance in future years as an indicator for in time, so to speak. So in the course of all of that Michigas, what we ended up finding is that there were a handful of variables within there that were actually relevant in predicting or forecasting the likelihood that a student would graduate after attaining that 45 credit hours threshold within 1 year. Disability status, race and ethnicity, age, dependency is an indicator of whether a student was considered for financial aid purposes dependent or independent. So a student, theoretically, a student living at home with parents versus one living on their own. The percent of part-time percent of their educational career that have been enrolled in part-time. at least the VCC, their hours earned the next year, and then the cumulative GPA in that year that they achieved 45 credit hours. And so in looking at the actual impacts of each, it's interesting because what happens, what logistic regression does is helps to show the relative impact of each. So, for example, what we see here in terms of the change in the likelihood of graduating or within a year, there's a significant impact for dependent versus independent students. So our dependent students were 512% more likely, or essentially 5 times more likely to graduate within a year than independent students, which makes sense because those students theoretically have fewer financial obligations, presumably fewer work obligations, and so there's a lot to be entailed with that distinction between dependent and independent. We also found that our non-disabled students were also much more likely to graduate within a year than disabled students who met that 45 credit hour threshold. Minority students were less likely than white students to complete within a year. And then age was also significant. So that negative 8%, or the 8% reduction in the likelihood of graduating within a year is with each year of age. So an individual who is 40 compared to an individual who's 20 excuse me, would have a much more significant impact of that age factor on their likelihood of graduating within a year. Similarly, when we look at the credits earned and the academic performance, we see that obviously, as you would probably expect, for each additional credit that a student completed in the year after they earned 45, the likelihood of graduating within the year increased. So that was of interest in trying to identify if there should be a theoretical minimum that we should put in terms of the number of credit hours that students were expected to earn in the semester after attaining 45 in order to receive the scholarship. We also found that the percentage of part-time enrollment in the past was a significant factor. I'm sorry. Actually, I see that the sign is mixed on there, so that should be negative. So as the percent of part-time enrollment increases, that was actually it reduced the likelihood that students graduated within the year. And that makes sense as well because historically, if a student is enrolling part-time, that most likely means that they're going to be enrolling in the future part-time. So less likely that they would be completing those additional 15 credits needed to get the associate degree within 1 year's time. And then finally, the cumulative GPA at the end of the semester they earn that 45th credit hour is positively correlated with their likelihood of graduating within the year. In terms of the overall modeling, just to get a sense of how well the model itself was useful or predictive, there's a couple omnibus tests that we look at for logistic regression. So there is an omnibus significance test that was a less than 0.0001 probability, which is what we would want to see in that omnibus test. There's also a pseudo R-squared called labor crux I, that in this case we found to be 0.264. So that's not exactly, but generally speaking, telling us that about 26% of the variance that we're seeing in whether or not students are graduating within the year can be accounted for by the variables that we're including in this model. And so it's not huge by multiple regression standards, but in terms of this pseudo R is used in logistic regression, that 0.264 is respectable compared to the general benchmark that we see where that ranges from 0 to 1, but it's highly unlikely that these percentages get above 0.5 in most cases. The Hasbury-Lemmershon test is a test to see how the chi-square predicted versus observed categories fit. And what we want to see in this case is that test not be significant, so not showing that there's a significant difference between observed and expected counts, to indicate that the model itself is not overfit and is correctly predicting or correctly forecasting the counts of the observed data. And then most important for us, what we also look at is how well the model actually correctly categorizes students. And so in this case, we found that the model using this for historical data correctly predicted 70% of the students, and we had a holdout sample tested, and that was close as well at 67%. So not quite at 100%, but very respectable in terms of the ability to put students based on those handful of criteria that we identified as significant into the correct bucket of graduating with university. So shifting gears and moving away from the more technical discussion of modeling, what was the actual purpose of all of that? And if you'll remember back to that timeline that we talked about a few slides ago, the value in that logistic regression and the probability scores that are generated really comes into focus here when we look at the applicant ranking and then identifying the comparison. So we use those significant factors of dependent status, cumulative GPA, racial intensity, age, those 6 or 7 factors that we identified. Use those to generate those probability scores, we'll be talking about those in a second. And those are used in this instance to score the applicants. It's one of the factors, one of those scoring criteria. And then we also use those to identify the comparison groups that we'll be using to determine whether or not this has an impact. So as I was mentioning, in the example here, we have a handful of records. This is the information that we generally would have in any sort of scoring process for this scholarship, where we would have the student listed, whether or not they completed the FAFSA, their total credits, GPA, the number of classes they still need to complete, but also that probability score that I mentioned that's an outcome of the logistic regression. And so if you look in the table that I have here, where we have Bruce Wayne, for example, has it's the probability score that comes from our logistic regression, but his is 7.39. And then Cara Zorel, hers is 70.34. So those two individuals have almost identical probability scores based on the collection of all of those, not demographic, but predictor covariates that we talked about earlier. And in the course of identifying an impact, if, for example, Bruce received a scholarship but Cara didn't, those would be a perfect comparison group where they have, in this modeling, based on those predictors that we identified, they have essentially similar likelihoods of graduating within a year based on the combination of factors prior to that achieving 45 credit hour threshold. And if one receives the scholarship and the other doesn't, we can use that as a means of analyzing what sort of impact, if any, the scholarship itself has. In the course of determining which of those students are actually receiving the scholarship or could receive it if they all applied, that score is also used to help identify the students who would most likely benefit from it. And so remember, we were talking before about one of the criteria that the foundation board had mentioned was important to them, that this scholarship and any funding like it be directed to the students who are most at need, which is really difficult to do in most circumstances unless you're just looking at financial need. The likelihood score that we have here is one way to also incorporate some of those other characteristics, their demographics and their past academic performance, into that decision-making process. So, for example, Clark Kent, who has based on our model, a predicted probability of 32% graduating within a year, compared to Lois Lane, who has 74%, is much less likely to graduate just based on uh, their own efforts than Lois. And so, in that sense, would be much more likely to benefit from additional intervention efforts. And so, in the course of conducting this analysis, and then the subsequent scoring for scholarship applications, what we would do is intentionally weight scores that were on the low end as more valuable, so to speak, on the scoring spectrum for the scholarship itself. So students who scored lower got a higher score in evaluating their chances of getting a scholarship, because we were intentionally focusing on the lowest end of the spectrum just in this modeling um, uh, category um, uh, to um, to direct the money specifically towards students that would most likely benefit. Let's see, and that's where you'll see in the table of the bottom right hand corner, that's the scoring template that was essentially used for applicants to the scholarship. The first one, the completion score, is where um, everything was scored on a 1, 2, 3 basis, but in the rubric you'll see that students who are unlikely to graduate without an intervention end up getting a higher score than the students who are. There's other criteria that we use, but this I thought was also valuable and something that we've never done before at ECC, where we're actually using this statistical modeling as a characteristic that's used in determining scholarship applicants score for the scholarship. So this was unique to us, and something that I hope will continue to be used in the future and will ultimately prove to be beneficial to this process. So in the course of conducting the scholarship, as I mentioned, we were accepting applications at the end of our school semester and through the summer. We identified that there were 254 students in our pool of near completers who had attained at least 45 hours, hours, or would have at the end of the spring semester. I think we had determined the pools slightly before grades were official, and then also earned a cumulative GPA of 2.0. We have 53 of those students requested applications, so about 20%, which is on par with other scholarships that we offer at ECC. But we found that only 16 students actually submitted applications. So less than a third of the students who requested them, only 6% of the overall pool, which was unfortunate, and most likely partly due to everything that was going on in the pandemic realm at the end of the spring semester and over the summer and currently through the fall and potentially spring. The thought was that the impact of everything that was going on outside of ECC may have also most likely depressed the number of applicants that were for the scholarship. Additionally, what we find at ECC is that we have very few students that in general apply for scholarships. That it's presumed that the process is much more labor intensive on the student side than it actually is. And there's also the thought by what we hear from students is that those scholarships generally only go to students who are doing who are earning 4.0 GPAs or did in high school. And so the thought is that scholarships are generally only for students who are performing exceptionally well academically. So from a practical standpoint, unfortunately, what we found is that all the students who applied received the scholarship. What we had initially intended for our outcome evaluation at the end of this program in the spring was that we would have applicants who were awarded the program, other applicants who weren't, just based on the various criteria that we were going over earlier. And then we would do a comparison of those two as kind of a naturally selected comparison group and treatment group. But unfortunately, because all of the students who applied received this scholarship, what we have to do now is compare applicants versus non-applicants who have similar predicted probability of success scores. And this is relevant. We're still looking at fairly similar groups of students, but it's relevant because there's a non-cognitive piece to it that we really can't rule out as a confound there. What we had wanted to do was compare the impact of funds on those students who were interested in it and who went the extra steps, so to speak, to complete the application. And now what we're going to be doing, unfortunately, but out of necessity, is comparing the impact of the funds based on that probability, but not accounting for any interest level the students might have. So in the current fall 2020 semester, just looking at the students who had earned the scholarship, we have as I mentioned, 16 students. We've identified a match sample, just like we were talking about in the earlier slide, looking at those probability scores of students who were in that original pool of scholarship applicants or scholarship invitees who did not apply but had logistic regression probability scores of likelihood of graduating with the year that were closest to those 16 students that received the scholarship. In looking at those two groups of students, what we're finding is that obviously those same 16 students are enrolled this semester. That was a condition of the scholarship that they be enrolled, so that's not surprising. But of the match sample group, we only have 9 students, so roughly half of the students actually enrolled this semester. Of the awardees, there's only 1 student who received any reviews or assignment mentoring, and conversely, almost half of the students who had enrolled this semester in the match sample group have earned reviews or assignment mentoring grades. So just in looking at their current academic performance and their follow through and enrolling in this current academic year, there are some just anecdotal differences between the two different groups. But these are the kinds of comparisons that we'll be looking at the end of next semester to evaluate whether or not there has been any sort of impact of the scholarship itself on students who are near that completion. So when we get to that point, this is what I was mentioning earlier with respect to survival analysis. When we get to the point of conducting that evaluation at the end of the year, we'll be using a different type of statistical modeling called survival analysis. Survival analysis is interesting because it doesn't, it's similar to logistic regression and multiple regression in terms of looking at forecasted observations over time. Forecasted observations and impacts of covariates, but it takes time into account where regression modeling doesn't. And that's relevant here because we're looking at the amount of time it takes from a student attaining that 45 credit hour threshold to their graduation. And what we're trying to do is compare the impact of treatments in this case, which lends itself to survival analysis. Survival analysis typically is used in biostatistics. The outcome almost exclusively used is death rates, which is kind of gross in and of itself and seems to set a bad omen. But in the course of the health industries, survival analysis is an essential tool in identifying the likelihood of death rates or other events happening over the course of the treatment program. And so in a typical health field survival analysis, what you would be looking at is a survival curve and the amount of time between two treatment groups, the amount of time from the first observation to the occurrence of some outcome, death or occurrence of some illness or something like that. And in order to illustrate an effective or an important treatment program, you would look to see if that survival curve was longer, so there was more time between first observation and death, for example, for the treatment versus the comparison group. In our case, we're actually looking at the opposite. So we want that event to occur as early as possible in across time for our treatment group, because we want this program to have an impact on how quickly students graduate compared to students who don't. And so that's an important consideration when we're talking about survival analysis here, because it does allow us to look at time as a factor that most other statistical modeling techniques don't. So as I was mentioning earlier, we have not a lot of interest, it seems, in the scholarship application. As we had talked about earlier, not everything went as planned. This is our pilot year, so that's to be expected. But what are the next steps? We plan on finishing the analysis at the end of this fall term. Looking at some of the things like grade, performance, academic performance in the term. See if any students have graduated in this fall semester, even though we're asking them to do so within the year, not necessarily within the term. And then also some retention metrics. Do students come back in the spring? What are some of those general outcomes that might be indicative of how impactful the scholarship itself has been? And then we'll repeat that at the end of the spring semester. The plan is still to use survival analysis, even though we don't technically have the same treatment and comparison group that we have talked about earlier, because our comparison group, as we were mentioning, is slightly different from our treatment group, but we'll still, for practical purposes, we'll still conduct a comparison of those two, and then filter in any conversations about possible compounds into those discussions after the fact. In terms of improving the process for the scholarship itself, and to hopefully entice more students to apply this upcoming year for fiscal year 22, the foundation was talking about improving the communication with applicants. So specifying that there are a limited number of applicants, and it's specifically for students at a certain credit milestone, not necessarily an academic program, and trying to encourage more student participation in that scholarship process. And then one of the other considerations is that we were using financial need as one of the scoring criteria here, which means that we have to, as a college, we have to know what the financial need of the student is. That unfortunately, we only know for students who complete their FAFSA or have some other ECC application that they complete, but there's very few students that do that for ECC scholarships and ECC grants. And we're anticipating that with the state of the Illinois high schools secondary education system, what will be happening as they work to make completion of the FAFSA for seniors a requirement each year. I believe that started this year, or will be this past year, or will be this current year. As we have more students who are coming into ECC already completing the FAFSA as part of that high school senior requirement, that should alleviate a lot of those issues that we're talking about with respect to limiting the pool unintentionally because of lack of student population that have actually completed FAFSA. And then one final consideration for us that is still up in the air is, as with everything during this time of COVID, funding is potentially an issue. So there have been talk that there may not be a scholarship for next year because the funding may not be available. And so that's something that we're still working to identify sources of funding for. And hopefully we'll be able to continue that into the fiscal 22 year so that we can generate more data. That's always our interest on the IAIR side of things, is generating more data so that we can do a better and more in-depth analysis. And we'll see how that goes in the future. So with that, I thank you for taking the time to watch this recording. Please, if you do have any comments or feedback or questions, my email address is here, drudden@elgin.edu. Please feel free to send me an email. And I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video.